Okay, welcome to Friday night class. You're here and I'm not. I hope that using this format of the videos will be the same as if I were here tonight. Before we go over the pretest, we have 15 problems to go over with the pretest. I really want to go over, I covered this for the folks who were here last week when we were doing chapter 7. I started talking about how we graph equations and what does it all mean. So first of all, we need to understand in graphing that there's two kinds of graphs that you're used to seeing. One is a graph where you have an x-axis and a y-axis, and it's sort of like this box right here. And we start at 0, and we could go in a positive direction on the x line, and we start at 0 and we could go in a positive direction on the y line. Now this graph here is one that's called a quadral graph because there's 4 quadrants. There's the positive quadrant here, but also down here in this box, x is positive, but y becomes negative. In this box over here, you can see y is positive, but x is negative. And then in this box down here, both x and y are negative. So I drew a line on the graph here based on an equation that I wrote on the board. And the equation says y equals 2x. So basically what that's saying here is that when y equals 2x, so when x is 0, 2 times 0 would be 0. So y would be 0. 2 times 0, 2 times x would be 0. Okay, now if x were 1, 2 times 1 would be 2. If x were 2, 2 times 2 would be 4. So I create a table with x and y values. Then I could plot these values on the graph. So for example, 0x, 0y. The next one, when x is 1, y is 2. The next one, when x is 2, and you can see here x is 2, y is 4. When x is 3, y is 6. When x is 4, y is 8, and so on. So you can see the pattern with that. It's a doubling pattern because we're saying y equals 2x. So now this line represents that equation y equals 2x. We could look at that line and we could make an equation out of it. We could look at the equation and plot the line. And in chapter 8, that's mostly what we're going to be doing with problems, is either looking at a graph and determining what its equation is, or looking at an equation and being able to graph it. I wrote one other equation up here for us to follow. And it's one where it's a little confusing when you first look at it because there's a whole bunch of letters there. I wrote y equals mx plus b. Now, how I could explain this, we already know what x and y are. X is the horizontal axis, y is the vertical axis. M, I'll get to in a second to demonstrate what that means. But the b, this part here, it says plus b. That's called the y-intercept. That means that where the line crosses the y-axis, in this case here, the line I drew crosses the y-axis at 0. So that's why you don't see anything after the 2x. It would be 2x plus 0, and that looks kind of silly because if you add 0 to anything, it doesn't change the value. So in this case here, the y-intercept is 0. So that plus b would be 0. Now the m part is the part I want you to understand. You look at this line here, and it looks like a pretty steep line. That steepness is called the slope. And in this case here, the slope of this line is represented this way here. My dad did roofing work, and in order to measure the angle or the pitch of a roof, they measured the rise, how much it went up, by the run, how much it went over. So rise and run. Y is the rise, x is the run. See, rise is vertical, run is horizontal. So all we need to do is pick 2 points on this line and determine how much it's gone up and how much it goes over between those 2 points. So the first point I had here was 0, 0. And let's say the next point I choose would be this one up here, which is x is 2, y is 4. Okay? So count along with me now. I'm going from this point here, I'll make it a little larger, to this point here. So I count up 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. So it was 4 steps to go up. 4. And then I count over. 1, 2. It was 2 steps to go over. So the rise in this case here, the rise is 4. The run is 2. So if I look at this fraction, 4 over 2, you could simplify that. 4 over 2 becomes 2 over 1, or just 2. Okay? So now look back at the equation. The equation says y equals 2x. That means that the slope is 2. Okay, so that's where we get this idea of the slope. Okay, so if we understand this here, writing an equation in this form. Now there's other ways to write equations, but for the sake of this class so that you can understand linear equations like this one here, we're going to stick with this form, which is called the slope-intercept form. And the slope-intercept form is y, so it's always going to be y on one side, and then you're going to have some number times x, that some number is going to be the slope, times x, plus or minus b, whatever the y-intercept is. If the y-intercept is a negative number, let's say it crosses down here, then that would be a negative number. So let's draw another line here and show that relationship. Let's say I have a line that crosses at negative 3. Okay, so I'll put a dot here at negative 3. That's the y-intercept is at negative 3. And let's say that line is going down sort of like this here. Okay, so now I have enough information to figure out what that equation is. If I use this format, y equals mx plus b, the first thing I'm going to look at is to say, okay, I'll say y equals, what's b going to be? It's going to be where it crosses the y-intercept. In this case, it crosses it at negative 3. So I put negative 3 in here. Now I need to figure out what my slope is. This first example, the slope was going upwards. That's a positive slope. It went up 4 over 2, or up 2 over 1. So it was 2 over 1. And so that slope was 2. Now this line, you notice, is going downhill. It's not going uphill and to the right, it's going down. So that's a negative slope. So if we look at this one here, we'll say, okay, let's count the rise and the run. In this case here, it's going downward. So if I went from this point to this point here, this point was x is 0, y is negative 3. This point, x is 2, y is negative 4. Okay, so if I count down, I have to go down 1, so that's negative 1, and then I count over 2, 1, 2. So the rise, in this case, would be negative 1, and the run is 2. So that slope would be negative 1/2.